the women's movement emerged from the New Left. And from the kind of, there was the Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, which was very relevant really today, but these were campaigns that were outside our immediate experience. They were on behalf of others, against the state, against capitalism, against imperialism, and so on. So Vietnam Solidarity, there was also the civil rights movement, very important in the United States. America very much influenced, American radicals very much influenced what was going on here in those years. I mean, looking at everybody, I see that nearly all of us are of a certain age, so this is not new for you, but I'll just remind everybody. And there was an insurgency around the world, in France, famously, and so on, and the anti-apartheid movement, and very importantly, an overlap with the counterculture. So we'd started to talk about things like, in political terms, and there wasn't a great distinction, about things like sexuality and everyday life, because there were a lot of psychiatrists involved. It was really linked to the world, the beat culture, writings and bohemian art worlds, and so on. And but in all these movements that were absolutely vital and dynamic, women were completely marginalized, astonishingly so. And an example is there was a Dialectics of Liberation Congress in 1967. It lasted for 2 weeks at the Roundhouse, and it was organized by radical existential psychiatrists and designed to create a genuine revolutionary consciousness by fusing ideology and action on the levels of the individual and mass society. But over the whole 2 weeks, there was not a single woman speaker. Women simply didn't count in that mass society or the individual. Juliet Mitchell was there, Sheila Rowbottom was there, Angela Davis was there, but none of them were invited to speak. And race was taken a lot more seriously then, and the Trinidadian American Stokely Carmichael, who was part of the Black Power movement in the States, was given a very substantial slot. That's important to remember, because actually Black Power did influence the style of feminism that was to emerge. So Sheila Rowbottom, I'm going to give you this quote because it's beautiful, really. She said about women at that time, "Women have been lying so low for so long that most of us cannot imagine how to get up. We have apparently acquiesced always in the imperial game and are so perfectly colonized that we are unable to consult ourselves. And because the assumption does not occur to us, it doesn't occur to anybody else either." So really, you know, we, at that moment, even though a lot of us were independent, active, educated, you know, well-traveled, we didn't really think about the way in which we were oppressed and marginalized. I know it sounds kind of weird, but really that's the case. And I heard, well, I'll talk later about my own experience, but the type of politics that was quite new, and in contrast to the politics of protest and resistance, you know, that all these other kind of movements were about, the women's liberation movement started this unprecedented struggle on behalf of ourselves, against our own oppression as women, not against the oppression of the Vietnamese or Black people in the United States, or, you know, and that's really what Black Power also taught us. So we started to explore our own oppression and kind of discovered it, you know, unpacked it. It was quite painful. It resulted in huge transformations to our personal lives and to our family lives, our you know, our partners, and also to what we were prepared to give up, as well as, or what we were frightened of giving up, really, as well as what we were embarking on. So and because it included changes in the way we lived, it was about the minutiae of everyday life. And, so it was about how we organized our households, and of course, because of that, the family became one of the kind of major issues that we explored. It wasn't actually at that point violence. It was the family. And yeah, I have another point here. Yeah, it was the domestic as well as the public sphere. And of course, we did look at the domestic sphere, but we distinguished ourselves from the first wave of feminists who we thought, I mean, actually they were into much more, but at the time, what we knew about the first wave of feminists was that it was for the vote for equality in the public sphere. So what we were really focused on was everyday life in the home, in our personal relations. So what was my experience? I've got something else. Oh yeah, the Tufnell Park Group. Okay, well, I joined the Tufnell Park Group in September 1969. There were about 4 groups at the time, and I already had 2 children. I was about to become a mature student at LSE. My youngest child, well, I actually had 3 children. My youngest child was 3 weeks old, and I carried him in a carry cot to that first meeting. But that wasn't unusual in our group. We were, I think, half of us. Well, first of all, there were a lot of Americans, and that was very significant. Of the 10 in the initial group, and I've got some great photographs of that initial group, 7 were from North America, mostly because of their partners and VSC activism and the US student movement. There were 3 Brits, and all of us were connected with abroad in one way or another. I mean, one had an American mother, I had 2 foreign parents, somebody else was married to a foreigner, and half of us already had children. I wasn't the only one. And that's very significant and became more significant. I mean, people today and other people think about women's movement at the time as predominantly preoccupied with equality in the public sphere, with objectification of the body, with things like that. And for some people, those were the issues, sexuality. But in my women's group, it was the family. It was childcare. And there was one woman, Shelley Wertis, who was doing a PhD in psychology, who wrote what was for me the absolutely critical paper, which was a critique of the Bowlby theory about the damage that maternal separation could do to children. So even if we'd been incredibly kind of free, we were always frightened of leaving the kids at home and what damage that could do. And we didn't make, even some fathers did quite a lot, we didn't make the kinds of demands that subsequently we were to make for, really fair division of childcare. So that was very important. And Shelley Wertis's article, all of this I discuss in more detail in that article that was quoted cited about looking back on the introductory page. And the other thing that's interesting now today was that over half of us, 7 of us out of the 10, were Jewish, either Jewish, half Jewish, or married to somebody who was Jewish. But it wasn't relevant at the time. I don't think anybody really thought about it or noted it even. But I mean, I kind of knew, and with hindsight, and now today I look back and I think, a bit like the civil rights movement in America, a very large, a disproportionate number, considering kind of population and so on, of activists were Jewish, certainly not to say all, but in the women's movement, in my group, and there were 4 groups in London at the time, were Jewish. We then organized the Oxford Conference. One of people in my group were among the organizers. And that was in February 1970. That's what I was at. And the march was 71. I was there with the kids again. But and I took one of my kids to the Oxford Conference and left 2 with my mother. It's also the kind of thing that we did, mothers stepped in occasionally. What was then? So the Oxford Conference was very important. And after the Oxford Conference, there were 600 women, and that was between 4 groups in women, feminist groups in 69, for women's liberation, must remember, women's liberation groups in 1969. We didn't use the term feminist at that time. And then there was the conference, the women's conference in Oxford. There were 600 women who attended it. There were a few men, and some of them barged into some of the women-only meetings, and the creche was run by men. And there are a couple of very key photographs taken by a good friend of mine, Sally Fraser, now Chandan Fraser, of Stuart Hall, among others, manning the creche. So that was an important innovation. And one of the major concerns, and I look back over the kind of what we were talking about and what was, there were the traditional things of equal pay, there were demands like that, but there were also demands or discussions about collective living as a solution to the issue of childcare, which counted for so much. And so that kind of politics. Oh, and the other thing is, our women's group, unlike JVL, it was very small, autonomous. There were all these, suddenly there were hundreds of women's groups all over Britain, autonomous. It was a kind of rhizomatic expansion. We didn't have a center, we didn't have chairs, we didn't have structures. The main policy was to let everybody have a go at speaking and to arrive at sort of consensus politics if we could. So there was collective action, collective living and childcare. That was the style of politics at that moment. And, there were, Mickey's just mentioned them, other styles of politics, but it's also interesting that all three of us ended up as academics, because as far as I was concerned, the main arena of struggle and debate was knowledge, was uncovering theories, pointing to how limited theories were. When I was at LSE, I went as a mature student just after I joined the women's movement, and I didn't get a very good degree because I was obsessed with kind of challenging every debate, asking everybody, but hey, what about women? What were women doing? Why were women not discussed? Was this the same for women as it was for men? Why have they been so neglected? So that's one of the things we started to do, and we ended up doing, and we became professors in the end because we wrote a lot, and now we're retired. So emeritus just means retired, really, but we are still keeping going in different ways. So what is the link to JVL? And I did there's another article that I mentioned before, actually, a book that I wrote, Visceral Cosmopolitanism, which is about the everyday transformations in Britain, the normalization of difference in Britain. It's called Gender, the subtitle is Gender, Culture and the Normalization of Difference. It feels a bit old-fashioned in some ways, published in 2007, a more optimistic moment, actually, than now. Nevertheless, there's quite a lot that's relevant. And my final chapter is autobiographical. And I talk about my Jewish and European heritage. And when I put non-Jewish, that's a reference to Isaac Deutscher. Is it Isaac Deutscher? Isaac Deutscher's term for people whose families belong to a kind of Jewish network, but were not in any way religious observant. My parents left Vienna. My mother was from Holland. She'd gone to study social housing in Vienna. The whole of my father's family were kind of socialists or communists. And even though they came from a kind of bourgeois family, all his siblings were left-wing. All the network was left-wing, but they mainly consisted of Jews. But my mother wasn't Jewish. She came from a theosophist socialist family. So that was my background. And when we came to England, of course, they didn't speak English. They weren't native English speakers. And so I learned German and Dutch before I learned English. And, that's my background, really. Okay, so what is the link now of that early women's movement to JVL? JVL does have personal elements, but it's not a battle against our own oppression. On the contrary, it's about fighting against the oppression of others, of vulnerable, horribly abused people, men as well as women, by Zionists who claim to speak for us, for all Jews, and we're challenging that. And we feel, I feel that I'm in a stronger position to do that, to make that challenge, if I speak as somebody who is Jewish. I know I'm only half Jewish, but I think my whole life as an immigrant, a refugee in this country, has been marked, is due to the fact that my father was Jewish and my mother, it was illegal in Germany for non-Jews for Jews to marry non-Jews at the time that my parents married and my older brother was born, and so on. And now, kind of what is the significance of how much is this related to feminism, really? I think Lynne's going to talk about it a bit more, but I mean, basically, not in my name is critical. It may not be the case for all Jews who are involved in the Jewish bloc. I think now, from what I've seen, are mainly younger Jews, mainly come from observant families, and may well have had to go through the consciousness raising process, that business of reflecting on how they were brought up and how they view the world, that we went through in the early women's movement. So that may be the link, but I don't think, as far as I'm concerned, it really happened at the level of JVL. We were all politicized decades ago, actually. Most of us probably in the 60s, certainly in relation to Israel for, the last quarter of a century, I would have thought. So, the difficulty of making sense and reconciling our backgrounds with our political action today has not been very difficult for most of us, I think. And so that's a great difference between JVL and the women's movement, WLM. And feminism is, but JVL is now the priority in my life. I mean, feminism is no longer a priority in my life, I have to say. It's not urgent now in my old age. Of course, I feel empathy and I feel profound concern, but it's not something that I need to kind of act on, except for on behalf of others. So that's a big shift from the kind of politics that we had in the 60s and 70s. I have 5 granddaughters, actually. So I feel very much on their behalf. And, so I'm definitely concerned about the kind of experiences of Palestinian women around the world, all these things that are marked by the Women's Day. But I don't feel part of it. Maybe it's just that I'm too old. So it may be the case for others as well. Maybe that's something we want to talk about. But I still do have a women's group and we still meet regularly, and we have been meeting for 50 years. We were all PhD students together in the 1970s. So, and we still meet. And so even though we don't discuss our oppression as women, we're just very good friends. We meet on a regular basis and we are very aware of our mutual history. Okay, so, and I also want to say, because my feminism is kind of fractured. In those days, we didn't think that women could be as awful as some women are. And the way, Lynne's just written a piece on neoliberalism and the way in which feminism has changed that came out today in Labour Hub that I thought was very good, because it talks about those transformations. But of course, today we have people like Daniela Weiss, we have people like Suella Braverman, we have and the people in America whose names I've forgotten at the moment, but they are really terribly violent and kind of aggressive, and things that we felt women were not going to kind of be like. We were going to be militant, but we weren't going to take on the worst aspects of masculinity. Have I spoken for too long?
That's fine. Yes. No.
Okay. All right. Well, let me see if there's one big question. Well, the question is, but, women may be awful, but there are still more men being really, really horrible. And so is there something about femininity, about being women, about empathy for others outside ourselves? Is there something special? But that's such a big question that's really for another day. So that was something. So I just want to say finally, yes. what JVL has given me and what feminism gave me is a powerful sense of belonging, of solidarity, of being in the vanguard of political protest and change. I think JVL really is those things. And so that is in common with my experience in the early women's movement.
So I want to begin by saying what an amazing time the early 70s was. So very much better than times are today. And that is crucial. Of course, not better in every way, and not, as we're about to see, necessarily better for women. But it's really important to realize how much more hopeful those times were than now, and for us and our generation than for those growing up today. So they were better times. But of course, women were, as Mica has said, quite decisively, quite absolutely second-class citizens. And the 60s were preeminently, as we've heard, a sexist decade. Every freedom lover, every Rolling Stone, every person with any agency, it seemed, was male. Think Dylan, Jagger, think anyone we remember from the 60s, practically, they were all men. And that's how we felt about ourselves. It's how we were brought up and so on. Certainly how I was brought up, how I was raised, quintessentially as subordinate to men. So the really amazing thing is how incredibly quickly, from hesitant beginnings, we turned that around. Women's liberation emerges with the writing, as we've heard here, of Sheila Rowbottom and others, many coming from the States and elsewhere. And it immediately began to shift our outlook on the world. And I had just arrived here at the close of the 1970s as a single mother with a 14-month-old baby from Australia, feeling totally alone and, lost, sort of wondering who on earth I was, when suddenly women's liberation arrives and everything becomes different. So Jewishness, I'm 100% Jewish, and it just didn't seem to be impacting on our lives then, although, interestingly, it might have. The first person who called for a celebration of Women's Day was Clara Zetkin. And of course, Rosa Luxemburg is also eager to celebrate women, socialists and feminists. And also, then again, as Mica says, with so many Jews in her first women's group, the people we were reading, so many of them were Jews. Shulamat Firestone, Adrienne Rich, Grace Paley, Marge Piercy, Cynthia Ornick. I could go on. They were Jewish, the people we were reading, but that wasn't what we were thinking about, even though later on they would start reflecting on that considerably. But no, for people like me, as mothers, as socialists, as feminists, we were busy fighting on all fronts to improve women's lot everywhere, to change the ways of seeing women as secondary citizens, of course, above all, demanding better services and resources. We were absolutely involved in community struggles on all fronts. And with that, there were certain victories. Our confidence grew. We were engaged in writing and, in local papers, in all sorts of things, which was building our confidence as writers, as people who could make their mark on the world. Or at least that was, I think, how a number of us were influenced by early women's liberation. And we did have an internationalist outlook, but we were thinking of freedom from colonialism for third world women. And of course, in particular, the issue of Ireland loomed very large. And many of my friends were involved in Troops Out and working for freedom for the north of Ireland from Britain. Then, we had various victories in the 70s. By the time Thatcher gets elected, which some of us were busy trying to organise against, particularly when I was working with Sheila Rowbottom and Hilary Wainwright and Beyond the Fragments, trying to say feminism should persuade the left of the importance of uniting against the rise of the right. Well, that's a battle that we're still fighting now, to unite the left, of course, to unite against the right. And what came to the fore more in the 80s was more of a cultural politics and an identity politics. And there were some early Jewish groups forming, although the main voices I remember were black voices. Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis here, Amrit Wilson, Margaret Busby, the Southall Black Sisters. They were the identities that we were supporting and fighting for, much more than a sense of Jewish identity, for me at any rate. And I don't think I was alone in that as a socialist feminist. And then come the 90s, we're up against a media-driven recuperation of feminism, trying to make it a movement that isn't really about resistance at all, but just about getting top girls and so on, as Carol Churchill wrote about in her play, and the pretense that that was all that feminists really wanted or should want, as Sheryl Sandberg would write at the beginning of this century with her Lean In. So, times were really changing and not so militant for a while within mainstream feminism. But of course, for us then, as Mica said, suddenly an altogether new issue emerges for us, concerned with Israel, with the Second Intifada, with Irene Bruegel, who we sadly lost years ago. Irene Bruegel visiting Israel and Palestinian territory and returning to say, look, as Jewish feminists, we need to support Palestinian struggle. They need us. And so in 2001, she calls this meeting that becomes Jews for Justice for Palestinians. And every person at that meeting, apart from Richard Cooper, was a socialist feminist. She called on her fellow oral socialist feminists to attend that meeting. And so immediately we all became involved in that politics. And it was a crucial time because the more we learnt about the history of this formation of Israel, we learnt about the Nakba, and then we learned very quickly, and some of us, as Mica said, visited there with Jews for Justice for Palestinians. We quickly found out just the terrible level of oppression of native Palestinians, their freedom of movement curtailed, their overall rights curtailed, frequent violence, above all, obviously, in the West Bank and Gaza, which was occupied territory. So some of us also not only made friends with left Israelis who'd been working for peace for a very long time, but with certain Palestinians, the most memorable voice being Iyad Siraj from Gaza. And what a disastrous loss it was, Iyad Siraj dying so young, because we always thought of him as the king of Gaza, basically, and he was always working with those left Palestinians against the occupation. And he died even before the Israelis left Gaza, and Gaza becomes basically a prison camp. So long ago, all those decades ago, when Gaza begins to be a prison camp that its inhabitants can't move out of. And so, from then on, we're engaged. So all of us in Jewish struggles. I was in a whole slew of different Jewish groups, Jewish Voice for Liberation, Jewish Voice for JFP, for liberation of Palestinians, but also then various American groups that started, always reading Jewish Voice for Peace, and then ending up with what was Jewish Voice for Labour until we start to be thrown out, so we become Jewish Voice for Liberation. But At the same time, of course, I begin to think about my own Jewishness, and my own Jewishness is incredibly interesting for us here, particularly the idea that to criticize Israel is anti-Semitic. Oh no, very far from that. Many Jewish voices were involved in anti-Zionism from the start. And some of those voices were my grandfather and great-grandfather in Australia, where meetings were held on the possibility of forming a Jewish state in Israel. And these forebears of mine are very significant in Jewish life in Australia. My grandfather was very friendly with the Governor General of Australia, Sir Isaac Isaacs, who was Jewish, and with the chief rabbi of Australia at the time, Rabbi Cohen, and they all agreed. It would be a very bad thing to set up a Jewish state in Palestine. It would be unfair to the people who live there, unfair to the Muslims, unfair to the Christians. And so what my grandfather Alfred Harris wrote, and he was for 40 years editor of the Hebrew Standard in Australia, and what he wrote then was that to set up a Jewish state in Palestine would be unjust, dangerous to a degree, even cruel in its inevitable consequences, and after all, unattainable. Well, tragically, he was proved right in everything he said, apart from that last crucial point, because come the Holocaust and Jews of Europe needing to find somewhere to be. And that was beginning. I think my grandfather died in the early 1940s. So he was already working with other Jews in Australia and elsewhere to try and find a safe space for Jews to go. Just, of course, when our countries in Australia or Britain or wherever else were clamping down, as they had before, and not allowing Jewish migration, not allowing these aliens in. And we know the Alien Act in the late 19th century was actually brought in to keep Jews who were suffering from pogroms back then out, not to let them in, those in need of help as refugees. So they were looking for places in Australia, in the Kimberley Mountains, in South America, and elsewhere. But what they found was that, of course, to set up a Jewish state with its own laws in someone else's country was hardly going to be acceptable. And so, we know how all this ended with an agreement by the UN, not with what we've got, but that working with Palestinians, that a Jewish state could be created. Well, the rest, as we know, is the unbearable history of Israel for the Palestinians, who have been oppressed, if not terrorized. And today, of course, they are simply terrorized ever since. But not only that, the worst thing of all was the way in which Israel was given such license to do whatever it liked to the native population. Well, actually, it gradually got worse and worse, and particularly as criticism began to grow from a few people that became aware of the mistreatment of Palestinians, the lack of rights for Palestinians, and indeed, the imprisonment. Almost every Palestinian family, as you may know, has somebody in prison over the years. So that sort of injustice did lead to some criticism, and that's when Israel begins to talk about anti-Semitism and the nature of anti-Semitism being not a dislike of Jews as Jews, forget about that, but instead criticism of the appalling behavior of Israel. So that's where we are today, with terrible license, the most appalling tolerance for what Israel has done. And today, not just what it's done to the Palestinians and continues to do with the ongoing genocide in Gaza, with the dispossession daily of Palestinians in the West Bank, and with their impunity to shoot or arrest or do whatever they like to Palestinians, which goes on day in, day out. But now, actually, it seems Israel is allowed to do whatever it likes in attacking and murdering its neighbours. And so with Trump there, we're in a situation in which Israel just seems to be the preeminent bully of the world, licensed to just go bombing and killing its neighbours. It seems almost at a whim. They don't have to have attacked it. Israel can just step in, whether it's to Syria, whether it's to Iran, whether it's to Lebanon. All these countries, such as Lebanon, have been unsafe ever since Israel becomes a state in 1948. And so, the consequences of this tolerance for Israel and this ridiculous belief that to criticize Israel's behavior is anti-Semitic, is what is responsible for so much of the horrors of the day. And, that's our role, to just keep on trying to point that out, because Israel is terribly important in the rise of the right today. Now, it's not just that Trump will allow Israel to do anything, but all these right-wing and fascistic groups, they all love Israel. On the march yesterday and on the march, always you see people holding up the British flag and holding up the Israeli flag. They're one and the same. The rise of the right and this tolerance for Israel as the bully of the world. But one thing I would say, in slight disagreement with Mica, is I don't think that feminism is unimportant today. In fact, I think it's rather crucial, because these bully boys of the right, one of the main things they're interested in, actually, is the subservience of women, is returning us back to the pre-1970s, when men had control over women. We didn't even have control over our own bodies. We weren't even allowed to buy houses. We couldn't do anything without the consent of some man. Now, that's exactly what the right wants to see today. And so we get many people talk about this. I mean, today, as much as ever, so the leading voices of feminism are Jews, Judith Butler, Naomi Klein, and so on. And they are pointing out the significance of gender oppression to the rise of the right, and the appeal, of the manosphere, as we could read about in yesterday's paper or today's paper. The idea that it's men who are oppressed now because women have some rights, because as women, we have been trying to assert ourselves in every way alongside men. And this is what the right promises to change. And so I would say that a feminism which is an anti-colonial socialist feminism is actually perhaps even more important than ever today. And of course, it's manifest in our struggles in relation to Israel, but it is broader than that, although Israel is always there whenever the right is on the rise. Support for Israel is always there. But this attempt to control women and put them back in their place is also there in the politics of the right. So I'll finish there. More than ever, we have so much to do, and I just hope we can keep doing it.